London, 1853. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Blackwood House drawing room, casting long shadows across the opulent furnishings that did nothing to warm the chilly atmosphere inside. The Dowager Duchess of Westmoreland, Lady Victoria Blackwood, stood with perfect posture before the massive marble fireplace, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged immaculately beneath a cap of Belgian lace, her black silk gown rustling softly as she delivered her pronouncement to her only son. Alexander Blackwood, the 6th Duke of Westmoreland, lounged in stark contrast to his mother's rigidity, his tall frame sprawled across a wingback chair with deliberate casualness, one booted foot crossed over his knee, his handsome features arranged in an expression of studied boredom that concealed the anger simmering beneath. "I have indulged your rebellious nature long enough, Alexander," the Dowager declared, her voice as cold as the rain pelting the glass. "Your father would be ashamed to see you reach the age of 32 without fulfilling your primary duty to this family. 3 months. That is all the time I shall grant you to take a wife, or I shall exercise my rights regarding your personal fortune, which remains, need I remind you, under my control until you marry." Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, his grey eyes narrowing as he regarded the woman who had shown him so little warmth throughout his life. "My father, may he rest in peace, married for duty and lived in misery," he replied, his deep voice deceptively calm, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the arm of his chair. "I refuse to repeat his mistakes, mother, regardless of financial consequences." The Dowager stiffened, her thin lips pressing together before she withdrew a folded paper from her reticule. "I have selected 3 suitable candidates from the finest families in England," she continued, as though he hadn't spoken. "Lady Margaret Harrington, the Earl of Pembroke's youngest daughter, or perhaps Miss Caroline Fitzwilliam, whose connections to the royal family would serve you well. The third, Lady Elizabeth Thornton, lacks beauty, but her dowry would restore the east wing of the estate quite nicely." Alexander rose to his full height, towering over his mother, a muscle working in his jaw as he fought to maintain his composure. "You may select whomever you wish, mother, but I will not marry to please you or to preserve fortune I can live without." With those words, he strode from the room, the heavy door slamming behind him with satisfying force. In the corridor, he paused, his breath coming in short bursts as rage coursed through him. For 32 years he had endured her manipulations, her cold calculations, her treatment of people as chess pieces to be moved for advantage. As he stalked toward the stables, heedless of the rain, a dangerous resolve formed in his mind. If she demanded he marry, then marry he would, but his bride would be someone so completely unsuitable, so thoroughly unacceptable to the Dowager Duchess, that his mother would regret ever issuing her ultimatum. His lips curved into a grim smile as he mounted his horse and rode into the storm, droplets of rain mingling with the hot anger in his eyes. He would find a wife, yes, but one that would serve as the perfect instrument of his revenge. 3 days after his mother's ultimatum, Alexander sought refuge in a small bookshop tucked away on a quiet Bloomsbury street, far from Mayfair and the prying eyes of society. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating towering shelves and casting a golden glow over the cramped interior, where motes of dust danced in the air like tiny constellations. The scent of leather bindings, ink, and paper enveloped him as he moved deeper into the shop, letting his fingers trail along the spines with a sense of peace he rarely experienced in his grand, empty mansion. It was in the section on medical texts that his hand collided with slender fingers reaching for the same volume, a comprehensive study on the latest treatments for consumption. Alexander turned, prepared to dismiss whoever had interrupted his solitude, only to find himself looking into the most direct and intelligent pair of brown eyes he had ever encountered. Miss Eleanor Winters did not step back or apologize as most women would upon recognizing a gentleman. Instead, she held her ground, her chin tilted upward to meet his gaze despite her petite stature. "I believe I was reaching for that particular volume first, sir," she stated plainly, her voice cultured but lacking the affected softness of society ladies. Alexander found himself momentarily speechless, taking in her simple blue dress, worn but immaculately kept, the practical arrangement of her chestnut hair, and the unmistakable shadows of exhaustion beneath her expressive eyes. "Surely a gentleman would concede to a lady in such circumstances," she added when he did not immediately respond, prompting him to raise an eyebrow at her boldness. "That would depend entirely on which party has the greater need for the text," he countered, curious to see how she would respond to his challenge. What Eleanor did next astonished him further. She launched into a detailed explanation of why she required the medical text, revealing both extensive knowledge of medicine and a passionate dedication to caring for her father, a once respected doctor, now bedridden with the same illness he had spent his life treating. As she spoke, Alexander learned that at 25, Eleanor supported them both by working as a governess during the day while tending to her father at night, studying medicine in what few hours remained to her. "You speak as though you've never been contradicted before, sir," she observed when he expressed surprise at her forthright manner. "I assure you, Miss Winters, that is precisely what makes our conversations so refreshing," he replied with the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in weeks. When the shopkeeper recognized the Duke and approached with fawning deference, Alexander watched Eleanor's expression shift from confusion to embarrassment as she realized his station. Yet even then, she did not simper or change her manner, merely adjusting her address with a subtle nod. As they parted ways outside the shop, Eleanor with the book he had insisted on purchasing for her despite her protests, Alexander found himself watching her walk away, her straight back and determined gait betraying both dignity and exhaustion. An idea began to form in his mind, dangerous and perfect in its potential to solve both their problems while delivering the ultimate insult to his mother. He would need to learn more about Miss Winters, this unusual woman whose circumstances and character might make her the ideal instrument for his revenge. With a decisiveness that had always characterized his actions, Alexander instructed his driver to discover where Dr. Winters and his daughter resided, the first step in a plan that would change both their lives irrevocably. The following afternoon, Alexander found himself standing before a modest two-story home in a respectable but declining neighborhood. The Winters residence bore the dignified shabbiness of genteel poverty, its exterior freshly swept though the paint was peeling, curtains meticulously clean but visibly mended. He rapped sharply on the door, adjusting his immaculate coat as he waited, the grandeur of his attire and carriage drawing curious glances from passers-by. When Eleanor opened the door herself, her eyes widened with undisguised shock at finding the Duke of Westmoreland on her doorstep. "Your Grace," she managed, her composure returning quickly, though a flush colored her cheeks. "This is unexpected." Alexander noted her simple grey dress, practical for her work as a governess, yet worn thin at the elbows, and the ink stain on her right index finger. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, Miss Winters, but our conversation yesterday left me with a proposition I wish to discuss without delay. May I come in?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before leading him into a small sitting room where medical books lined the walls, and simple, well-polished furniture spoke of care despite limited means. An elderly man reclined in a worn armchair by the window, his resemblance to Eleanor unmistakable despite his gaunt frame and the unhealthy flush on his hollow cheeks. "Father," she said, her voice gentle, "this is the Duke of Westmoreland. He wishes to speak with us." Dr. Winters attempted to rise, triggering a violent coughing fit that shook his frail body. Eleanor moved to his side with practiced efficiency, supporting him with one arm while offering a handkerchief with the other. When the episode subsided, Alexander stepped forward, wasting no time with pleasantries. "I shall be direct, as I value candor above all else. I find myself in need of a wife, and you, Miss Winters, find yourself in need of financial security. I propose a marriage of convenience that would benefit us both." The silence that followed was absolute save for Dr. Winters' labored breathing. Eleanor stared at Alexander as though he had sprouted a second head, her lips parted in astonishment. "I beg your pardon," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need money and security," Alexander continued calmly. "I need a wife my mother would despise. It's a simple transaction that benefits us both." I would provide complete financial support for you and your father, including the best medical care available, and in return, you would become the Duchess of Westmoreland. Eleanor's shock transformed into indignation, her spine straightening as she regarded him with newfound coldness. My hand is not for sale, Your Grace, regardless of how prettily you package the offer. I may be poor, sir, but I have my dignity. Alexander had anticipated outrage, but found himself unexpectedly admiring her principled stance, despite her desperate circumstances. I respect your position, Miss Winters, he replied, oddly intrigued by her refusal when most women would have leapt at such an opportunity. However, practicality sometimes must outweigh pride. Consider my offer carefully before rejecting it so definitively. Think of your father. Dr. Winters stirred, his weathered hand reaching for his daughter's. Eleanor, he murmured, but another fit of coughing interrupted whatever he intended to say. Alexander watched as terror flashed across Eleanor's face before she masked it with determination, the brief glimpse revealing the true precariousness of their situation more clearly than any words. I shall take my leave, he said quietly, extracting a card from his pocket. My address, should you reconsider. With a formal bow he departed, the image of Eleanor's defiant eyes and her father's wasting form accompanying him as his carriage pulled away from the curb. He had presented his offer as a cold transaction, yet something about her dignified refusal in the face of obvious need stirred unexpected respect. Whatever her answer might be, Alexander realized Miss Eleanor Winters was indeed the perfect candidate to infuriate his mother, though perhaps not solely for the reasons he had initially imagined. 1 week after the Duke's proposal, Eleanor moved wearily through the dreary corridors of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where she volunteered on her single afternoon off from governess duties. The wards stretched before her, a seemingly endless procession of iron bedsteads occupied by the city's poor, the air heavy with the mingled scents of carbolic acid, illness, and suffering. She paused to wipe the fevered brow of an elderly woman, murmuring words of comfort that felt increasingly hollow as her own circumstances grew more desperate. At home that evening, shivering in her small attic bedroom where the fire had long since been deemed an unnecessary expense, Eleanor discovered her father had secretly pawned his gold pocket watch, a wedding gift from her mother, to pay for the medical text Alexander had tried to purchase for her before insisting on giving it as a gift. The realization struck her like a physical blow. For 3 years since her mother's death, she had sacrificed everything to maintain the illusion that they were managing, that her father's illness need not rob him of his dignity along with his health. Yet here was evidence that her pride was costing him the few treasured possessions that remained to him. Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the medical text open on her lap to the chapter detailing new treatments available in Switzerland. Treatments that might extend her father's life by years, rather than the months the local doctor had grimly predicted. Treatments that would forever remain beyond their reach, unless she accepted the Duke's outrageous proposal. Pragmatism warred with principle as she considered his offer through the night, turning it over in her mind until dawn lightened the sky outside her window. The following afternoon found Eleanor standing before the imposing entrance to Blackwood House, her best dress brushed and pressed, her hands trembling slightly though her resolve was firm. The butler who admitted her could scarcely conceal his disdain as he led her to a vast library where Alexander awaited, standing before a marble fireplace that could have housed her entire bedroom within its hearth. Your Grace, she began without preamble once they were alone, I have considered your proposal and am prepared to accept under certain conditions. Alexander turned, surprise flashing briefly across his features before satisfaction took its place. He gestured for her to continue, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. I require respect, though not love, she stated clearly. Freedom to care for my father, including bringing him to live in whatever residence we shall occupy. And I must insist that you harbour no romantic expectations of this arrangement. Our marriage will be one of mutual convenience only. I accept your proposal, Your Grace, but understand this. While you may purchase my hand, my heart and mind remain my own. Alexander crossed the room toward her, his tall figure imposing, yet his expression held something beyond the triumph she had expected, something that might have been admiration. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Winters," he replied, his deep voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "Your spirit is precisely what makes you suitable for my purpose." A contract of sorts was drawn up that afternoon, outlining Eleanor's conditions and Alexander's financial provisions, which proved far more generous than she had anticipated. As she departed Blackwood House with the signed document safely tucked in her reticule, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. She had sold herself to save her father, entering a loveless marriage with a man whose primary motivation was to spite his mother. Yet beneath the cold practicality of their arrangement, she had glimpsed something in Alexander that suggested the Duke of Westmoreland might be more complex than his arrogant facade implied. Whether that complexity would make their impending union more bearable or more difficult, only time would tell. For now, it was enough to know that by sacrificing her dreams of marrying for love, she had secured her father's comfort and care for whatever time remained to him. A fortnight after accepting Alexander's proposal, Eleanor found herself standing beside him in the small chapel at Westmoreland Estate, exchanging vows in a hastily arranged ceremony attended only by her father, the dowager's furious presence, and a handful of Alexander's closest friends. Eleanor wore a simple ivory gown purchased with the allowance Alexander had immediately established for her, her hands steady despite the enormity of what she was undertaking, her responses clear and unwavering, though her heart pounded beneath the modest lace of her bodice. "Doctor," Winters observed from the front pew, his pride in his daughter evident despite the oxygen that now visibly colored his sunken cheeks, while the Dowager Duchess glared from the opposite side, her expression a satisfying mixture of horror and disbelief as her son deliberately tied himself to a penniless doctor's daughter. The wedding breakfast that followed in the grand ballroom of Blackwood House provided Eleanor's first true taste of aristocratic society, the massive crystal chandeliers reflecting light across polished marble floors, where elegant couples had danced for generations, the gilt-framed portraits of Alexander's ancestors seeming to watch disapprovingly as she entered on his arm. The whispers began immediately, ladies hiding venomous comments behind fluttering fans, gentlemen studying her with undisguised curiosity or disdain. She heard fragments clearly enough. Governess, fortune hunter, how dare she, and the inevitable speculation about whether she was with child. Through it all, Eleanor maintained the dignity that had first caught Alexander's attention, her posture impeccable, her manner gracious despite the deliberate snubs of several high-born ladies. Alexander remained at her side, his hand occasionally brushing the small of her back in what observers might mistake for a husband's affection, but which Eleanor recognized as a subtle gesture of support that confused her as much as it comforted her. Several of Alexander's friends approached to offer congratulations, their initial skepticism giving way to thoughtful consideration as Eleanor engaged them in intelligent conversation, particularly Lord James Hartwick, whose genuine warmth stood in stark contrast to the general frost of the gathering. Later, Eleanor observed Lord Hartwick corner Alexander near the punch bowl, his expression serious as he spoke in hushed tones. "Playing with a woman's life to spite your mother is beneath you, Alexander, even at your worst." When Alexander merely shrugged, Lord Hartwick shook his head in evident disappointment before approaching Eleanor to offer a brotherly kiss on her cheek and a whispered promise of friendship should she ever require it. That evening, Eleanor was shown to her chambers in the east wing of Blackwood House, rooms of such opulence that she momentarily froze in the doorway, overwhelmed by silk damask wallpaper, a massive tester bed draped in azure velvet, and a sitting room larger than their entire previous home. Alexander appeared in the connecting doorway that led to his own apartments, the awkward tension between them palpable as they regarded each other across the expanse of her new domain. "Sleep well, Duchess," he said finally, his use of her new title emphasizing the strangeness of their situation. "A maid will attend you in the morning." He turned to leave but paused when Eleanor called his name, her voice soft yet determined. "Thank you for providing for my father so generously," she said. "The physician you engaged has already improved his comfort considerably." Alexander nodded, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he withdrew, closing the door firmly behind him. Left alone, Eleanor changed into a nightgown, with the help of a young maid who clearly found her new mistress as bewildering as Eleanor found her new circumstances. Unable to sleep, she wandered into the corridor hours later, following the sound of voices to a partially open door where the dowager's cutting tones sliced through the silence. That woman is utterly unsuitable, a common governess with no breeding, no connections, no dowry. You have made yourself and this family a laughingstock, Alexander, all to indulge your childish need to rebel against me. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation, but it was Alexander's response that froze her in place. "My wife, mother," he said, his voice cold with a fury Eleanor had not witnessed before, "has more intelligence, dignity, and genuine worth in her little finger than most of the vapid, scheming debutantes you would have had me marry. You will treat her with the respect her position as my duchess deserves, or you will find yourself no longer welcome in my home." Stunned by his defense, Eleanor retreated silently to her chambers, this glimpse of genuine feeling from the man she had married, complicating her understanding of their arrangement. Perhaps there was more to the Duke of Westmoreland than the arrogant aristocrat who had proposed a loveless marriage to spite his mother, just as there was now more to Eleanor Winters than the desperate daughter who had accepted his offer to save her father. Spring blossomed into summer as Eleanor settled into her new role as Duchess of Westmoreland, the vast library of Blackwood House becoming an unexpected sanctuary where she and Alexander gradually discovered common ground. The magnificent space spanned 2 full stories, leather-bound volumes lining every wall from floor to ceiling, comfortable reading chairs nestled in alcoves beneath towering windows that admitted dappled sunlight through ancient oak branches. Here, Eleanor spent hours absorbed in medical texts, while Alexander attended to estate business at a massive desk near the fireplace, the silence between them evolving from awkward tension to comfortable companionship as weeks passed. The transformation began when Alexander discovered Eleanor annotating a complex treatise on pulmonary diseases, her precise notes revealing knowledge that surpassed many practicing physicians. Fascinated despite himself, he inquired about her conclusions regarding a new treatment, leading to their first genuine conversation since their wedding, her passion for medicine temporarily eclipsing the formal politeness that characterized their interactions. Within a month, Eleanor had established a small infirmary in a vacant cottage on the estate, initially treating minor ailments among the servants, before word spread to tenant families, who began appearing at her door with everything from fevers to farm injuries. Alexander observed her work from a distance at first, noting her gentle efficiency with laboring women, her patience with frightened children, her dignified compassion with the elderly. On the rare occasions he accompanied her on these visits, he witnessed the transformation her presence brought to simple cottages, her practical knowledge alleviating suffering where expensive physicians had failed or been unaffordable. The devotion she inspired among the tenants both surprised and impressed him, their gratitude manifesting in humble gifts of fresh eggs, hand-knitted shawls, or simply heartfelt blessings that clearly meant more to Eleanor than the priceless jewels in the Westmoreland vaults. The dowager continued her campaign to undermine Eleanor at every turn, arranging dinner parties where aristocratic ladies deliberately excluded the new duchess from conversation, circulating rumors about her common origins, even suggesting to visiting dignitaries that the marriage was merely Alexander's temporary rebellion and would soon be annulled. Each attempt was met with increasingly firm resistance from Alexander, who found himself genuinely angered by these attacks on a woman whose conduct had been nothing short of exemplary. The most significant shift occurred on a rainy afternoon when Alexander sought Eleanor in the library to discuss a matter of estate business, only to realize he had been deliberately seeking her company with increasing frequency, valuing her practical perspective and direct honesty. He found himself watching her as she bent over a ledger, copper highlights gleaming in her chestnut hair, her slender fingers turning pages with the same care she showed when bandaging a child's wound. The realization that he had begun to genuinely admire his wife struck him with unexpected force. "You've transformed the lives of those tenant families, Eleanor," he said later that evening as they shared a rare private dinner in the library, firelight casting warm shadows across her features. "They speak of you as though you've performed miracles." Eleanor smiled, the expression softening her normally serious countenance in a way that Alexander found increasingly appealing. "Not miracles, Alexander, merely basic human decency, something your mother might benefit from studying," she replied with the forthright honesty he had come to appreciate. Rather than taking offense at her criticism of his mother, Alexander found himself laughing, the rich sound filling the space between them and bridging the careful distance they had maintained. In that moment, with rain pattering against the windows and the scent of old books enveloping them, both recognized that their marriage of convenience had begun to evolve into something neither had anticipated, a partnership based on growing mutual respect that hinted at the possibility of deeper connection neither had included in their original arrangement. Autumn arrived with a chill in the air, and a much-anticipated invitation to the Harlington Ball, an annual event hosted by the Earl of Harlington at his ancestral estate just 10 miles from Blackwood House. The invitation marked Eleanor and Alexander's first appearance at a major social gathering since their wedding 3 months prior, a test of their standing in society that both approached with private trepidation, though neither admitted it to the other. Eleanor prepared meticulously, selecting a gown of deep emerald silk that Alexander had commissioned from London's finest modiste, its elegance suited to her new station, yet modest enough to avoid appearing ostentatious. The Harlington estate ballroom took Eleanor's breath away as they entered. Hundreds of candles in massive crystal chandeliers, illuminating a space large enough to accommodate over 300 members of England's highest society. Gilded mirrors multiplied the light to dazzling effect, reflecting the jewels adorning ladies' necks and the polished buttons on gentlemen's formal attire, while a 20-piece orchestra played from a raised dais at one end of the enormous room. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares as Alexander presented her to their hosts. The Countess of Harlington, offering a correct if cool greeting, while clearly assessing the former governess's deportment for any sign of inadequacy. For the first hour, Eleanor navigated the treacherous waters of aristocratic society with dignity, her months as Duchess having taught her to maintain composure despite the whispers that followed her progress through the room. Alexander remained attentive, his hand at the small of her back as he guided her from one introduction to another, his protective stance not going unnoticed by observant eyes. The confrontation came during the supper dance, when Alexander was momentarily engaged in conversation with the Earl. Lady Penelope Darlington, daughter of a marquess and notorious for her sharp tongue, approached Eleanor with false sweetness, a glass of red wine balanced deliberately in her manicured hand. "How brave of you to attend," Lady Darlington remarked, her voice carrying just enough to attract attention from nearby guests. "It must be terribly difficult to suddenly find yourself among your betters after spending your life in service." Before Eleanor could respond, Lady Darlington gasped in mock dismay as she stumbled forward, the contents of her wineglass splashing across the front of Eleanor's emerald gown. "Oh dear," she exclaimed with transparent insincerity, her eyes glittering with malice. "How clumsy of me. But perhaps you can simply scrub it out, given your experience with menial tasks." The surrounding guests fell silent, watching for Eleanor's reaction to this deliberate humiliation. She stood perfectly still, her face betraying nothing of the mortification burning through her veins. But before she could formulate a response, Alexander materialized at her side, his expression thunderous. "Lady Darlington," he said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that Eleanor had learned preceded his most intense anger. "You have just demonstrated why breeding without character produces the worst kind of aristocrat. My wife has shown more dignity, intelligence, and genuine nobility in her short time as Duchess than you have managed in your entire privileged existence." He turned to Eleanor, removing his own handkerchief to blot ineffectually at the spreading stain. "Shall we depart, my dear? I find the company here suddenly intolerable." The journey home passed in tense silence, until they were halfway to Blackwood House, when Alexander suddenly ordered the driver to stop beside a moonlit stream. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion as they sat facing each other in the swaying carriage, "I must apologize for subjecting you to such cruelty." Eleanor shook her head, her composure finally cracking as tears threatened. "It is what I expected, Alexander. What I am unaccustomed to is having someone defend me so fiercely. The vulnerability in her admission seemed to break something loose in Alexander, and without warning he moved to sit beside her, one hand lifting to touch her cheek with unexpected gentleness. "Our arrangement has become complicated for me, Eleanor," he confessed, his grey eyes searching hers in the dim light of the carriage lantern. "Complicated how?" she whispered, heart thundering beneath her ruined gown, as his face drew closer to hers. "I find myself no longer thinking of you as my mother's punishment, but as my unexpected reward," Alexander answered. And then his lips were on hers, tentative at first, then with increasing certainty, as Eleanor responded to his touch. When they finally broke apart, both breathing quickly, Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his chest, fear shadowing her eyes. "We agreed to a marriage of convenience, Alexander, nothing more. I cannot allow myself to believe in something deeper only to discover later it was merely gratitude or passing attraction." Alexander captured her hand, pressing it more firmly against his heart. "What began as convenience has become necessity, Eleanor. These past months have shown me a woman of such substance that I find myself increasingly unable to imagine my life without her." Eleanor turned her face away, torn between longing and self-protection, the carriage continuing its journey toward Blackwood House while autumn leaves swirled in its wake, mirroring the tumultuous emotions now complicating what had once seemed a simple arrangement between two practical strangers. Winter descended upon Westmoreland Estate with unusual harshness, transforming the once vibrant gardens where Eleanor had planted medicinal herbs into a frozen landscape of stark beauty. Inside Blackwood House, life had found a comfortable rhythm in the months following the Harlington Ball, with Alexander and Eleanor developing a cautious tenderness that neither fully acknowledged, yet both increasingly relied upon. Dr. Winters had passed peacefully in his sleep as autumn leaves fell, Eleanor at his bedside holding his hand, Alexander a steady presence behind her chair, his quiet strength sustaining her through grief that might once have destroyed her had she faced it alone. By December, Eleanor had resumed her work with the tenant families, often returning windswept and chilled but satisfied with her contributions, unaware that each exposure to the bitter elements was weakening her resistance to the illness that had taken her father. The first signs appeared subtly. A persistent cough she dismissed as nothing serious, unusual fatigue she attributed to winter melancholy, a slight flush to her cheeks that Alexander initially mistook for the effects of cold air on her delicate skin. It was only when she collapsed during breakfast, her teacup shattering against the mahogany table as fever overtook her, that the terrifying truth became impossible to ignore. Alexander refused to accept the severity of her condition at first, assuring himself and the household that his strong, capable wife would recover quickly with proper rest. But as hours stretched into days with Eleanor's fever climbing relentlessly, her breathing growing labored and her once clear voice reduced to delirious murmurs, panic replaced denial. He dispatched riders to London, summoning every reputable physician in the city, offering fortunes for their immediate attendance, pacing the corridors outside her sick room like a caged predator, while servants scurried from his path. The cheerful morning room Eleanor had favoured was hastily converted into a sick room to spare her the journey upstairs, its sunny yellow walls now seeming a cruel mockery of her pallor, the ticking of the ornate French clock on the mantel, marking each precious moment slipping away. Alexander dismissed his valet, abandoned all pretense of ducal dignity, and took up residence in a chair beside her bed, his clothes rumpled from constant vigil, his face haggard with fear as he watched each laboured rise and fall of her chest. "Sir, you must rest," urged the physician from Edinburgh, a specialist in consumption whose reputation had drawn him to Westmoreland Estate. "The Duchess' condition remains grave. It may be some time before we see improvement." "I will not leave her," Alexander replied, his voice hoarse from sleeplessness, his hand gripping Eleanor's limp fingers as though physical contact alone might tether her to this world. "Do whatever must be done. Spare no expense, but I will remain here." The Dowager Duchess arrived uninvited on the 5th day of Eleanor's illness, sweeping into Blackwood House with her usual imperial manner, only to falter at the threshold of the sick room, visibly shaken by the sight of her formidable son reduced to a hollow-eyed shadow of himself. "Alexander," she began, her voice uncharacteristically tentative, "you must take care of your own health. The servants say you have neither eaten nor slept properly in days." Alexander did not look up, his gaze fixed on Eleanor's face. So still she might have been a waxwork, but for the rapid, shallow movements of her chest. "If she dies, mother, none of it matters," he whispered, the raw anguish in his voice striking the dowager silent. "My title, my wealth, my position, all of it meaningless without her. I married her to spite you, but she has become everything to me." The admission, spoken in a moment when he believed Eleanor beyond hearing, fell into a room suddenly silent, save for the merciless ticking of the clock and Eleanor's labored breathing. The dowager stood transfixed, watching as her son, the arrogant duke who had defied her at every turn, pressed his wife's palm against his cheek, tears tracking unashamedly down his face. "Please, Eleanor," he pleaded, his voice breaking on her name. "You cannot leave me now, not when I have only just learned what it means to truly live, to truly love. Fight this, my heart. Come back to me." In that moment, witnessing her son's genuine devastation, the Dowager Duchess finally understood what she had failed to see before. The marriage she had condemned as mere rebellion had transformed into a love so profound that its loss would destroy the son she had sought to control. She retreated silently, her own heart heavy with the realization of how thoroughly she had misunderstood both Alexander and the remarkable woman he had chosen, whose worth could now be measured in her son's unconcealed grief and the fervent prayers of servants and tenants gathering daily outside Blackwood House, awaiting news of their beloved Duchess. Dawn broke over Westmoreland Estate, golden light creeping through partially drawn curtains to illuminate Eleanor's sick room after the longest night of Alexander's life. The physicians had withdrawn hours earlier, their grave expressions and hushed consultations confirming what Alexander already knew. His beloved wife's condition had deteriorated beyond their expertise, her breathing now so shallow it was barely perceptible, her fever burning with an intensity that seemed impossible for her increasingly frail body to sustain. Alexander knelt beside her bed, his untrimmed beard and disheveled appearance rendering him unrecognizable as the proud duke who had once commanded every room he entered. For 7 days he had barely left her side, refusing food and sleep as though denying himself these necessities might somehow transfer his strength to Eleanor. His large hands enveloped her small one, his forehead pressed against their intertwined fingers in a posture of supplication foreign to his nature. "You cannot leave me now, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice raw from exhaustion and unshed tears. "Not when I've only just learned to love, not when we have so much life still to share. Remember the medical garden you planned for spring? The travels we discussed? You must see Florence, just as you always dreamed. Please, my heart, fight this darkness. Come back to me." The door opened quietly behind him, but Alexander did not turn, assuming it was merely another servant bringing fresh water or linens. Instead, he felt a hand on his shoulder, the touch tentative yet unmistakable. "Mother," he acknowledged, too exhausted for anger, too desperate for pride. The Dowager Duchess stood beside her son, her usual imperious demeanor replaced by genuine concern as she regarded the still figure on the bed and the broken man beside it. "I have brought someone, Alexander," she said softly. "Dr. Morrison from Edinburgh. He specializes in cases like Eleanor's and has had success with an experimental treatment when all seemed lost." Alexander raised his head slowly, hope warring with disbelief as he looked past his mother to the distinguished gentleman who entered carrying a medical bag. The doctor approached Eleanor's bedside, his experienced hands gentle yet efficient as he examined her, his expression grave but not defeated. "Her constitution remains strong despite the fever," the physician observed. "There is still reason for hope, Your Grace, though I must warn you the treatment I propose carries its own risks." "I would try anything," Alexander replied, rising to his feet with newfound energy. "Anything at all." The dowager stepped forward, her hand finding Alexander's arm in a gesture of support so unexpected that he stared at her in disbelief. "I sent for him the moment I understood what she truly means to you, my son," she explained, her voice softening. "I was wrong about her. Wrong about many things." The acknowledgement, coming from a woman who had never admitted error in her life, momentarily stunned Alexander. In that moment, mother and son reconciled without words, united by their shared concern for Eleanor. Dr. Morrison worked through the morning, administering a treatment involving ice baths to reduce the fever, followed by a carefully measured tincture of his own creation. Alexander and the dowager took turns assisting, passing cloths, changing linens, maintaining their vigil with shared purpose that would have seemed impossible mere days earlier. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor's breathing had eased slightly, the first encouraging sign in days. By evening, her fever showed the first tentative signs of breaking, her skin no longer burning to the touch, though still far from normal. Alexander refused to leave even then, maintaining his position beside her through another night, speaking to her constantly as though his voice might serve as a guide leading her back from the darkness. The sun had just begun to rise again, casting the room in soft golden light, when Eleanor's eyelids fluttered and slowly opened, her gaze unfocused at first before settling on Alexander's exhausted face. "You look terrible, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet carrying the hint of her characteristic directness. Alexander stared at her in disbelief, before a laugh escaped him, part sob and part joy, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he gathered her hand to his lips. "And you, my love, have never looked more beautiful," he managed, his entire body trembling with relief. The dowager, who had been dozing in a chair nearby, woke at the sound of their voices, her own eyes filling with uncharacteristic tears as she observed the naked adoration on her son's face, the miracle of Eleanor's survival, and the undeniable love between them that had somehow transformed all their lives. Eleanor's recovery would be slow, the danger not entirely past, but in that golden moment as dawn broke over Blackwood House, illuminating the three figures in the sick room, it was clear that something fundamental had changed for the Westmoreland family. What had begun as a marriage of spite and convenience had evolved through crisis into a bond so profound it had healed not only the breach between Alexander and his mother, but the wounded places within their hearts that had kept them from truly connecting with others. Spring sunlight dappled the extensive gardens of Westmoreland Estate, transforming the landscape that had been barren with winter frost just months before into an explosion of color and fragrance. The medicinal garden Eleanor had planned during her convalescence now flourished in neat beds surrounding a central fountain, lavender, rosemary, feverfew, and dozens of other healing plants arranged with both aesthetic beauty and practical purpose in mind. A year had passed since her near-fatal illness, a year of healing and profound transformation for the Blackwood family. Today, the garden played host to the annual Westmoreland Spring Festival, an event that had once been a formal, stilted affair under the previous Duke, but which Eleanor had reimagined as a celebration that brought together aristocracy and tenant families alike. Alexander stood at the edge of the terrace, observing with quiet pride as his wife moved among their guests, her emerald gown complementing the new fullness of her figure as she carried their first child, due to arrive by midsummer according to the royal physician. Society ladies who had once snubbed the former governess now eagerly sought her company, her intelligence and compassionate innovations in healthcare having earned their genuine respect. Even Lady Penelope Darlington approached with conciliatory smiles, though Eleanor received her with a graciousness that Alexander knew he could never have managed in her position. Most remarkable of all was the sight of Eleanor, deep in conversation with the Dowager Duchess, the two women gesturing animatedly as they discussed the expansion of their joint project, a clinic for impoverished women and children in London's worst slums. The transformation in his mother still astonished Alexander, her imperial manner softened by genuine admiration for the daughter-in-law she had once disdained. Her formidable organizational skills now directed toward meaningful charitable work rather than social manipulation. Lord Hartwick appeared at Alexander's side, offering a glass of champagne with a knowing smile. "I believe congratulations are in order, old friend," he remarked, nodding toward Eleanor's gently rounded abdomen. "Though I must say, when I warned you about playing with a woman's life, I never anticipated such a thoroughly happy outcome. Neither did I, Alexander admitted, his gaze following Eleanor as she paused to accept a small bouquet from a tenant child, her face luminous with joy. I married her to spite my mother, believing myself incapable of genuine attachment. Now I cannot imagine life without her. When I think how close I came to losing her, he paused, the memory of those desperate days still powerful enough to constrict his chest. How ironic that your act of rebellion led to your salvation, Hartwick observed. I have never seen you so content, Alexander. It suits you. As afternoon mellowed toward evening and guests began departing, Alexander sought out his wife, finding her resting on a stone bench beside a blooming rosebush, one hand resting protectively over her abdomen. "Are you tired?" he asked, his voice gentle as he sat beside her, concern evident in his eyes. "A little," she admitted with the honesty he had come to cherish, but happily so. She turned to survey the garden, satisfaction in her expression. "The clinic plans are finalized. Your mother has been remarkably effective in securing patronage from families who once would not acknowledge my existence." Alexander smiled, taking her hand in his. "She has found her true calling, thanks to you. As have I." They sat in comfortable silence, the garden around them alive with birdsong and the gentle rustling of new leaves. Finally, Alexander reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I have something for you," he said, opening it to reveal an exquisite emerald and diamond ring, far more elaborate than the simple band she had received during their hasty ceremony. "Our wedding was arranged with such speed that there was no time for a proper ring, one worthy of you. This one, I hope, better represents what you have come to mean to me." Eleanor gazed at the ring, emotion filling her eyes as Alexander slipped it onto her finger alongside her original wedding band. "I married you to spite my mother, but you married me to save your father," he said softly, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Perhaps we are more alike than we knew." "No, Alexander," Eleanor corrected gently, meeting his gaze with the directness he adored. "I married you for security, but I stayed because I discovered the heart you tried so hard to hide. Even before I fell ill, I had begun to love the man beneath the Duke's facade." She placed her free hand against his cheek, her touch conveying the depth of her affection more clearly than words. Alexander turned his face to press a kiss into her palm, marveling at how this one gesture, so simple yet so intimate, could still affect him so profoundly after a year of marriage. As twilight descended upon the gardens of Westmoreland Estate, the Duke and Duchess remained on their bench, silhouettes against the fading light, hands intertwined in a simple tableau that belied the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. What had begun as the coldest of arrangements, a marriage conceived in spite and sealed in pragmatism, had blossomed into a partnership of such depth and passion that it had transformed not only their own lives, but touched countless others through their united purpose. The distant sound of carriage wheels marked the departure of their final guests, but Alexander and Eleanor lingered in their garden sanctuary, content in the knowledge that the greatest journey still lay ahead, not as Duke and Duchess, but as husband and wife, partners and parents, bound together not by convenience, but by the most inconvenient and wonderful of emotions, a love neither had sought, but both had found in the most unlikely of circumstances.